Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. I've entitled this one, The Rocket-Powered Nightmare, for two reasons. Firstly, when Allied airmen first experienced a rocket-powered fighter interceptor flying straight up at them at speeds far beyond what their own fighter escort could possibly do, it must have seemed like science fiction come to life to attack them. But no matter if the Comet was a dream to fly, it was also a nightmare to its very own crews, for the reasons that we will look at soon. So I normally say let's dive into this one, but in this case, we'll be rocketing right up into it. The Comet story begins with Dr. Alexander Lippisch, who was born on November 2nd, 1894 in Munich. Unlike many people, he knew exactly when he was bitten by the aviation bug. It was in September 1909 at Tempelhof Field in Berlin when he witnessed an aerial demonstration carried out by none other than Orville Wright. During World War I, Lippisch entered the army and worked as an aerial photographer and mapper. After the war, he began working for the Zeppelin Company, and he developed an interest in gliders, as did seemingly everyone else interested in aviation in Germany did at the time. The Treaty of Versailles that had ended World War I had forbidden Germany from building powered aircraft, but for some reason the treaty did not consider gliders as aircraft, and so gliding became very big in Germany during the interwar years. So if the Treaty of Versailles was intended to hobble future German aviation, it ended up doing the exact opposite. It forced Germans to start their flying in this very basic way and encouraged development in design literally from the ground up. Starting from there, you can even toss out some assumptions that you might have had if you hadn't started that way. For example, the assumption that airplanes needed a piston engine with a propeller or even a tail. In 1921, Lippisch began working with another designer and inventor, Gottlob Espenlaub, to build a new glider, and they decided to leave off the tail. Why did one need a tail anyway? It adds so much parasite drag, and if we could do its job with other features on the aircraft, then why not eliminate it? Their first glider, the Lippisch-Espenlaub E2, had no tail, and I don't know how well it flew, but it began a process of him designing and building dozens and dozens of gliders for the next 10 years. In 1925, his reputation as a designer and builder of gliders got him appointed as director of the Ruhmreisten-Gesellschaft, or RRG, which was an organization that brought together glider research groups and the construction facilities to build them. So let's leave Lippisch tinkering with tailless gliders for a little bit and talk about Fritz von Opel. Fritz Adam Hermann von Opel was the grandson of Adam Opel, the founder of the Opel Company, which, to use an American example, would make him kind of like Henry Ford's grandson. He became the director of testing for the family business and was also put in charge of publicity, testing, driving, and competing with fast boats, fast cars, and fast motorcycles. Basically, if it was fast, Fritz was interested. In the late 1920s, Fritz connected with some members of the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, or the Space Flight Society. These guys were into rockets, and were looking for a patron, and Fritz had a need for speed, a flair for publicity, and lots of money. So these two groups went together like peas and carrots. This collaboration was known as Opel Rack, with the Rack being a shortening of Rakete, the German word for rocket. Fritz provided the Opel Company, and of course, the money, and the team started building a rocket car, which was known as the Rack 1. These were publicity stunts, but they worked. These rocket car demonstrations became a real thing, and crowds, including many famous people, came to see them, in what was the 1920s version of what Evel Knievel would do in the 1970s. The whole fad even had a name, the Raketenrummel, a rocket rumble, and also gave Opel his very cool nickname, Rocket Fritz. The RAK 3 car attained a top speed of 256 km per hour on June 23, 1928, breaking the then world's speed record by nearly 40 km per hour in front of 20,000 spectators. Now, the RAK cars had already had airfoils installed, but upside down, in order to produce the downforce to keep the cars from becoming unintentionally airborne. There's not much of a leap to turning the airfoils around the other way to generate lift and make a rocket plane. But initially, they didn't make their own plane. They bought one of Dr. Lippisch's aircraft, which was known as the Enta, or Duck. They strapped on some solid rockets made by the Friedrich Wilhelm Sanders Company, renamed it the RAK 1, and this was the very first aircraft to fly under rocket power on the 11th of June 1928. The first test flight was good, but on the second, one of the rockets exploded and the plane was wrecked, although the test pilot survived. But von Opel was not bothered, and he ordered a new aircraft, which he also called the RAK 1, to be built from scratch. Now, this guy seems to have had a lot of forward-thinking design ideas, but not much of a knack for original names. On the 30th of September 1929, von Opel then arranged a public flight with him at the controls at Frankfurt am Main. Von Opel announced that this was the world's first rocket plane, apparently having amnesia about the other earlier but non-public test flights in the other first RAK 1. Historians have gotten around this problem by calling this RAK 1 the world's first dedicated rocket plane, as it was built with rocket power in mind from the get-go. But Dr. Alexander Lippisch just kept grinding away at it following the dying down of the Raketenrummel, mostly working on delta-wing tailless aircraft designs. In 1933, the RRG became the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug, or the German Institute for Sailplane Flight, which was known as the DFS. Meanwhile, Gerhard Fiesler, the designer of the famous Fiesler Fi 156 Stoich, I should really make a video about that one, had been working on his F3 Vespa, or Wasp. It was unorthodox to say the least, featuring large delta wings with canards and pusher-puller engines in both the nose and the tail of the plane. Unfortunately, it was highly unstable, causing it to crash on its very first flight. They tinkered on it some more, but it crashed again. Fiesler decided to drop the project. But Lippisch and his buddy, Professor Walter Georgi, secured the funds from the Reich Luftfahrtministerium, which was the Reich Air Ministry, and hereafter to be referred to as the RLM, to buy the aircraft from Fiesler and set to making it work at the DFS. Lippisch removed the canards and the rear engine and renamed it the Delta IV-A. It flew better, but still crashed. Now that government money was involved, authorities were beginning to wonder if this was a case of good Deutschmarks being thrown after bad, and they investigated what the heck was going on. Because with this decade-long obsession with developing tailless aircraft, no matter what the cost or danger, Lippisch was heading into mad scientist territory. Anyway, it was Georgi's intervention that kept the authorities off their backs, even though the same authorities had decided that this project was an aeronautical dead end. But more tinkering led to the Delta IV-B and then the C. Along the way, Lippisch and Georgi had reduced the sweep of the wings and added small, dowturned fins at their tips, while also lengthening the fuselage somewhat and adding a small rudder. In 1936, the Delta IV-C was presented to the Luftwaffe, and test pilot Heini Dietmar found it to be an extremely stable and well-behaved design, which is pretty amazing for something that had been deemed an aeronautical dead end. No, it's alive! The test aircraft finally earned an airworthiness certificate and was given an official RLM designation, the DFS-39. A powered follow-up version with a small propeller engine was called the DFS-40. At this point, the RLM suddenly noticed the DFS-40, just like how in the movies the football captain suddenly notices the formerly bookish ugly girl who has taken off her glasses and let down her hair. The RLM said, "I'd really like to put a rocket in that airframe." And so they did. And the result was the DFS-194, which was powered by the Walter RI-203 rocket engine. Glide tests were successful in early 1940, and in August, long-term project test pilot Heini Dietmar lit the candle and took the DFS-194 to 550 kilometers per hour. That's 340 miles per hour. Even under rocket power, the aircraft remained having excellent flying characteristics and was safe to fly at nearly twice the planned speed. So now they renamed the concept Project X and transferred it over to Messerschmitt to make the rocket-powered fighter a reality. The fighter would have a swept back, not quite delta wing, a large rudder, and no horizontal stabilizer. It still had in its DNA its origins as a glider, in that it would land on a skid that would be extended before settling down. For movement on the ground and takeoff, the fighter would ride on an axle and two wheels that would be dropped after liftoff. A tractor and dolly system, called the Scheuschlepper, would be used to position the aircraft before flight and pick her up after landing. It was coming time to test the prototype, but first the new fighter needed a new name. The designation Me163 was specifically chosen to sow confusion amongst the Allies. Messerschmitt had previously built and then cancelled a Bf-163 liaison aircraft, and it was hoping that the enemy intelligence services just wouldn't catch on to the BF versus ME distinction and conclude that any reference to the number 163 was just follow-up work for the earlier liaison aircraft design and not something new. So the Me163A prototype arrived on the scene in 1941 and was sent to Peenemünde to be mated up with the HWK R2-203 rocket engine. On the 2nd of October 1941, again, test pilot Heini Dietmar took Me163A with the tail number KESW up and set a new world speed record of 1,004.5 kilometers per hour or 624.2 miles per hour, with the aircraft performing splendidly. 10 unarmed Me163As were initially ordered and built for pilot training and further testing. There was great excitement over the impressive performance of the 163, and the plan was to place Comet squadrons in 40-kilometer rings, that's 25 miles, around any targets that needed protection from Allied bombers. And production models were now ordered. Many refinements were made to these B models. The wheel and axle on the A had springs to absorb bumps during the takeoff roll, but they proved to be too springy. And in the new B models, the springs were removed and the wheels and axle relied on the shock-absorbing quality of the landing skid to deal with the jolts of the takeoff sequence. Another quality that worked too well was the wing. It glided so well that pilots were having trouble touching down and staying down during the landing. Of course, a go-around was impossible as the rocket was out of fuel at that point, so flaps were added to help out. For operational aircraft, a source of electrical power was needed for the radio, reflector gun sight, certain instruments, and the firing circuits for the twin cannon. It was found that just having a lead-acid battery installed wasn't reliable enough, so a ram air turbine and associated electrical generator was installed in the nose. The very earliest 163 prototypes were powered by an earlier rocket engine that had many problems, including that it was impossible to throttle, meaning that it ran either at 100% or not at all, and it tended to clog, causing power fluctuations, or worse than that, it could explode. The 100% power setting caused problems when the aircraft reached its cruise altitude. Without the effort required for climbing anymore, the aircraft at 100% power would quickly reach nearly supersonic speeds for which it was not designed, and the compressibility issues would cause control problems. So, for the B model, the Walter HWK-109509 rocket engine was used. This engine actually ran on two different types of fuels, known as hypergolic propellants. And just like two individuals that upon meeting erupt into a torrid, passionate love affair, these two liquids, when mixed, would react spontaneously and violently. The first liquid, known as C-Stoff, was a mix of 30% hydrazine hydrate, 57% methanol, and 13% water. The second, which was the oxidizer, meaning that it provided the oxygen for the reaction, was known as T-Stoff and was an 80% concentration of a hydrogen peroxide-based formula. The good thing about hypergolic propellants is their utter reliability to burn, but that can also be a disadvantage. T-Stoff and C-Stoff, if brought together in any way, shape, or form, would result in an explosive reaction, creating superheated steam, nitrogen, and air. If controlled within the mantle of the rocket engine, it provided a forward thrust of approximately 17 kilonewtons. That's 3,820 pounds of force. I'm not exactly sure what this means because, as the reverse of the saying goes, this is rocket science. What I do know is that handling these fuels was a dangerous pain in the butt. Firstly, both were toxic to humans. Also, T-Stoff was a very dangerous chemical to handle because it would also interact with cloth, leather, human skin, or really any other combustible material, and cause spontaneous combustion. So, special rubber suits were needed for the ground crews when working with it. T-Stoff also corroded iron and steel, and thus had to be kept in aluminum tanks. On the other hand, C-Stoff gleefully ate through aluminum, and so had to be kept in glass or enamel-coated vessels. Both liquids were clear and indistinguishable from each other, and so errors in mixing the two were possible and would be catastrophic. So extremely strict and detailed fuel hygiene procedures were needed. Separate trucks were used for the two types of fuel. Items containing T-Stoff markings were in white, while C-Stoff trucks, containers, and tank markings were in yellow. The tanker trucks carrying T-Stoff and C-Stoff, clearly marked with the color-coded T and C, were forbidden to come within 800 meters of each other. The procedure was to load the C-Stoff hydrazine methanol-based fuel first. The Comet's C-Stoff filling point was located in the rear dorsal fuselage, just ahead of the Comet's vertical stabilizer fin. After that tank was topped off and the C-Stoff truck had left the area, the other tanker truck carrying the very hyperactive T-Stoff hydrogen peroxide oxidizer would be tanked up through a different point on the Comet's dorsal fuselage surface, located not far behind the rear edge of the pilot's canopy. In order to prevent spontaneous explosions, the area and all the equipment had to be periodically flushed with water in order to get rid of lingering spills. I was unable to find out how often it happened, but failures of the fuel system, especially on takeoff or landing, if plumbing would break and leak causing a mixing of the fuels, would be obviously disastrous. And still, there was the issue of how to throttle the rocket engine. Later, Comet B and the C models had a more simple engine throttling system with two combustion chambers, both only capable of running at their most efficient 100%. The big main chamber, called Hauptofen, which I think means main oven, which is pretty cool, provided the climb power to get to altitude and then was turned off. The second, smaller chamber, or Marschofen, located beneath the main one, was meant to provide the high-speed but manageable cruise power needed for level flight. This little engine could be turned on or off to provide bursts of about 400 kilograms of force. That's 3,900 newtons or 880 pounds, and provide about 8 to 12 minutes of powered flight. On the 6th of July, 1944, Heini Dietmar took up a Me163B with the new engine configuration and set a new unofficial world speed record of 1,130 kilometers per hour. That's 702 miles per hour. Although he landed with almost all of the vertical rudder surface broken away from the flutter, he did land safely, and that speed record would stand until the 6th of November 1947, when broken by Chuck Yeager in the Bell X-1. For fighting, the 163 was initially fitted with two 20mm cannon, and later production aircraft were upgunned to two 30mm 108 Maschinenkanone. The Comet went operational with Erprobungskommando 16, that's Service Test Unit 16, commanded by Major Wolfgang Später in July 1943. Their initial base was at the Peenemünde West Field, but they had to depart there following RAF bombing raids. They moved around a bit, but settled down in northwest Germany at Bad Schwischenhahn airfield from August 1943 to August 1944. Major Später flew the first ever Me163B combat sortie on the 13th of May 1944 from this base. His Comet may have been painted red in a nod to Manfred von Richthofen's Fokker triplane, although if it actually had been red, it was subsequently repainted to the standard colors. So, what was it like to be an operational pilot and fly and fight in the rocket-powered Comet? Firstly, special training and procedures had to be learned. New Me163 pilots trained in Stummelhabit gliders, which were similar to the Comet with a short wingspan and a high landing speed. These training gliders had a machine pistol mounted in the glider nose to allow for gunnery practice. The Comet was unpressurized, and so the operational ceiling was actually limited by what the pilot could endure for several minutes while breathing through an oxygen mask without losing consciousness. So, prospective pilots underwent altitude chamber training to prepare them for the thin air of the stratosphere without the benefit of a pressure suit. Perhaps the most interesting fact of all of being a Comet pilot was the special low-fiber diets that were prepared for them. The extra rapid ascents could cause extra rapid expansion of gas in the gastrointestinal tract, causing severe tummy pain. It seems that it wasn't just the fuels that were dangerous in the Comet. The farts were potentially explosive also. So I guess the literal Luftwaffe soup Nazis would tell the Comet pilots, "Nein, no bean soup for you." As for actual flight time, the mission would begin with a scharfe Start, or hot takeoff, with the 163 on its two-wheeled dolly. At a speed of 320 kilometers per hour, that's 200 miles per hour or more, the aircraft would lift off and the pilot would fly level at low altitude until achieving the best climb speed of around 667 kilometers per hour, that's 420 miles per hour. At this speed, the pilot would jettison his wheels, retract his extendable skid, and then pull up into a 70-degree angle of climb. In 3 minutes, the appropriately named Comet would reach 12,000 meters, that's 39,000 feet. At that point, the main engine could be switched off and the smaller one used for level cruise flight at around 880 kilometers per hour, that's 550 miles per hour, or faster. At this speed, no Allied fighter could catch it. For an aircraft that had its origin in such unstable experimental types, the Comet was known to be remarkably agile and easy to fly at high speed. Rudolf Opitz, the Luftwaffe's chief pilot, said of the Me-163 that it could fly circles around any other fighter of its time. But the outrageous speed was also a disadvantage. It meant a target was passed in seconds. Due to that exceedingly short time frame, it required superior marksmanship to bring down an enemy bomber. One innovation to make things easier was a weapon called the Sondergerät 500 Jägerfaust, which was 10 single-shot, short-barreled, 50mm, that's 2-inch, guns mounted in the wing roots and pointed upwards. Kind of like Schlager music, but mounted at 90 degrees. 5 were installed in each wing root and were fired automatically by a photocell mounted in the upper surface of the Comet, which was triggered by detecting the sudden change in brightness when the aircraft flew under and into the shadow of a bomber. As each of these guns fired and the shell shot upwards, the gun barrel that fired it was also ejected downwards, making it a recoilless, albeit disposable, weapon. The device was supposedly only used once in combat, destroying a Lancaster bomber on the 10th of April 1945. Following the attack runs, the Comet pilot would glide his aircraft back to the field, extend his landing skid and flaps, and land as a glider. At that point, the Scheuschlepper tractor, which really was an agricultural tractor that had been modified for military use, would come and lift up the aircraft, either by the use of 2 arms or by inflatable airbags, and then tow it back to the start area for refueling, rearming, and remounting on a wheeled axle. Switching from an experimental to an operational status, in the winter and spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's first Me-163 fighter wing, Jagdgeschwader 400 in Brandis near Leipzig, was formed and led by Major Später. JG-400's mission was to protect the Luna synthetic gasoline works and the large synthetic fuel plants at Politz. More units of rocket fighters were planned for Berlin, the Ruhr, and other important locations. But it was not to be. For although the 163 was pleasant to fly, was a good gun platform, and had powerful cannon, its operational disadvantages far outweighed its advantages. Firstly, although Allied pilots were shocked at its speed and maneuverability at the outset, they very quickly learned that the Comets had a very short fuel endurance, and that all that was necessary was to leave them alone for a few minutes until they had exhausted their fuel, and then you could swoop in on them while they were in their gliding phase back, or strafe them on the ground. Although it shot down 16 aircraft, mainly 4-engine bombers, it lost 6 of its own due to enemy action and 9 to other causes. This was not a good balance sheet in a war where Luftwaffe pilots often racked up kill scores of dozens or even hundreds. Although several hundred Comets had been built, and almost 100 delivered to operational units, like much of the Luftwaffe at the end of the war, they were mainly grounded due to lack of fuel. There was a plan, and the beginning work was done for a replacement for the 163, known as the Me-263. It was to have more fuel capacity, pressurization for the pilot, and an actual retractable and extendable landing gear, so as to do away with the whole hassle of the Scheuchschleppel thing. They built 3 of them, and they did do flight-towed glider testing until there was no more fuel for the Me-110 towplanes. The project languished until the facilities were occupied by the American Army in April 1945. 1 prototype was destroyed, 1 ended up in the US, and the other went to Russia, and ended up being the basis for the MiG I-270 interceptor. After the end of the war, there were multiple accidents when Allied pilots attempted to fly the tricky Comet. Ultimately, the brass decreed that these test flights should be forbidden. But 1 Allied test pilot refused to take no for an answer. Captain Eric Brown, RN, and the chief naval test pilot and commanding officer of the captured enemy aircraft flight. Brown later said that he had flown 5 tailless aircraft throughout his career and referred to the Comet as, open quotes, the only one that had good flight characteristics." Close quotes. It was a fitting tribute to the work of Alexander Lippisch. So, what happened to Lippisch? He was scooped up by Operation Paperclip and was taken to the United States after the war, where he worked at the White Sands Missile Range. After that, he worked for the Collins Radio Company in their aeronautical division in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He then became interested and worked on ground effect and VTOL vehicles until the end of his career, and he died in Cedar Rapids on the 11th of February, 1976. In 1985, he was inducted into the International Air and Space Hall of Fame at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. What about Heini Dietmar, the test pilot who had somehow managed to survive testing all iterations of the Comet, either not powered or powered, and even up to perhaps breaking the sound barrier and bringing a Comet back with much of its tail fin missing? He died in a crash in 1960 while test flying the HD-153, which was a small, light aircraft of his own design that looks about as harmless as a tricycle-wheeled Piper Cub. Fate sure is funny. As for surviving aircraft, there are actually many examples due to the fact that so many intact Comets were scooped up for evaluation by the Allies at the end of the war. Somewhere between 48 Comets were captured and 28 were shipped out for testing. Although intact Comets can be seen on display in Australia, Germany, the UK, and Canada, I'm going to only talk about a few. Werknummer, or serial number 191301, an Me163B, was brought to the USA after the war and transported to the U.S. Army Air Forces facility at Muroc Dry Lake Bed in California for testing. The tests began with unfueled Comets being towed behind a Boeing B-29 Superfortress up to an altitude of about 10,000 meters, that's 35,000 feet, before being released for glides back to Earth. Unfortunately, the discovery of delamination of the aircraft's wooden wings caused the planned powered flights to be cancelled. This Comet is now on display at the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center near Washington, D.C. An Me163B can be seen at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. This Comet, Werknummer 191095, was acquired from the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum. I find it interesting that during the aircraft's restoration in Canada, it was discovered that the French forced laborers who had assembled the Comet in the factory had deliberately sabotaged it during construction by placing stones between the rocket's fuel tanks and its supporting strapping. I guess in the hopes that these would then puncture the tanks, and we know what that would do. They had also used contaminated glue in assembling the wings, and to make their point totally clear, they had written patriotic French slogans inside the fuselage. My favorite Comet, though, is the Me163B that is on display at the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. It was part of JG-400 and captured at Husum and was shipped back to Canada in 1946, along with her sister Comet that was previously mentioned, the one at the U.S. Air Force Museum. I love it for several reasons. Firstly, it is located in one of my favorite parts of the museum, nestled under the wing of a Lancaster and parked beside a Lysander. The Comet is so well preserved that the skin is sleek and shiny smooth and always makes me think of a dolphin's skin. The color-coded and labeled ports for the T-Stoff and C-Stoff are clearly visible. The tiny propeller for the ram air turbine is easy to see, and my students always ask about it before they know that the aircraft was rocket-powered, especially as we have just flown to the museum in my Cessna 172, and the prop on the 172 is so much bigger than this one. If you have enjoyed this video, please do your part and become a member of the channel or drop me a super thanks. If you can't do either of those, then please just like and subscribe. It's really appreciated. Until next time.